The town of Oakhaven swore Clara Higgins was a dead woman walking. At 19, with skin like porcelain and hands uncalloused by labor, she was traded like cattle to Jedediah Boone, a towering, scarred mountain man reputed to have killed a grizzly with his bare hands. He lived high in the unforgiving Blackwood Peaks, raising 5 feral children entirely alone. When the tavern doors swung shut behind them, the whispers began. They gave her a week before the mountain broke her. But the townspeople of Oakhaven were fools, because what happened next didn't just shock them, it brought their entire corrupt world burning to the ground. The year was 1882, and the Colorado Territory was as ruthless as it was beautiful. In the mining town of Oakhaven, morality was a luxury few could afford, and Josiah Higgins was completely bankrupt in both coin and character. Clara Higgins stood in the suffocating, smoke-filled parlor of the Golden Spur Saloon, her hands trembling inside the pockets of her faded gingham dress. She had been dragged out of bed in the dead of night by her father. Josiah's hands were shaking, his eyes wide with the manic terror of a man who had gambled away his life. Across the green baize of the poker table sat Mayor Horace Whitfield. Whitfield was a man of immense, quiet cruelty, a wealthy land baron who owned the sheriff, the bank, and now, it seemed, the Higgins family. $800, Josiah, Whitfield purred, taking a slow draw from his cigar, a sum you could not hope to earn in 3 lifetimes sweeping the livery stables. But I am a merciful man. Whitfield's predatory gaze slid to Clara, lingering on her pale, terrified face. I am in need of a housemaid, someone to tend to my personal quarters. Sign the girl over to my employment for the next 10 years, and the debt is forgiven. The entire saloon fell dead silent. Everyone knew what employment in Whitfield's personal quarters meant. It was a death sentence for a young woman's soul. Josiah, weeping openly, reached for the pen. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She prepared to run, to throw herself out the window into the muddy streets, but before Josiah's pen could touch the parchment, the saloon doors exploded inward. A blast of freezing mountain wind swept through the room, extinguishing half the oil lamps. Standing in the doorway was a nightmare wrapped in furs. It was Jedediah Boone. He was a myth spoken of in hushed tones by the townsfolk. Standing at 6'4", with shoulders as broad as a barn door, Jedediah was a creature of the high peaks. A jagged silver scar slashed down the left side of his bearded face, disappearing into the collar of his heavy wolfskin coat. He rarely came down from the Blackwood Peaks, and only ever to trade furs for coffee, salt, and bullets. The town knew him as a widowed recluse who commanded the mountains. They also knew he had 5 motherless children up there, wild as coyotes. Jedediah's heavy boots thudded against the floorboards as he crossed the room. He didn't look at the mayor. He didn't look at the gawking patrons. He looked only at Clara. His eyes were the color of forged steel, cold and piercing. The girl. Jedediah's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. She looked sturdy enough. Ain't sickly? What? Josiah stammered, shrinking back. Jedediah unhooked a massive leather pouch from his belt and slammed it onto the poker table. The heavy thud of raw gold dust and nuggets echoed like a gunshot. There's $1,000 in raw Blackwood gold in that bag. More than enough to clear this fool's debt. Mayor Whitfield stood up, his face flushed with sudden fury. Boone, this is none of your concern. The girl is entering my service. The girl, Jedediah corrected, turning his massive frame toward the mayor, is coming with me. My young'uns need a mother, a woman to keep the hearth and mend the clothes. She'll do. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. The terrifying mountain man had just bought her. You can't do this, Whitfield spat. She's not property. Neither is she yours, Jedediah countered smoothly. He turned to Josiah. The gold is yours. The girl is mine. We marry tonight, legally, before Reverend Miller, or I take my gold back to the mountain, and Whitfield can have your hide. Josiah didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy leather pouch with greedy, shaking hands. She's yours, Boone. Take her. Within the hour, a terrified Clara stood in the freezing, drafty chapel. Reverend Miller, rushing through the vows out of pure fear of the towering groom, pronounced them man and wife. Jedediah hadn't touched her, not even to hold her hand during the vows. When it was over, he simply turned toward the door. "Grab your coat, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We have a long ride, and the snow is coming." As Clara mounted the massive roan gelding behind him, the townswomen peered through their curtains. Gwendolyn Pritchard, the town gossip, was heard whispering loudly from her porch, "That beast will break her in a week. Those feral children will eat her alive. Mark my words, we'll be burying that poor girl come the spring thaw." The journey up the mountain was a grueling 2-day descent into a frozen hell. Clara clung to the back of Jedediah's saddle, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat to shield herself from the biting wind. He was like a stone pillar, unyielding and silent. He didn't offer words of comfort, didn't ask if she was cold or tired. He only stopped to water the horse and force her to eat strips of tough, dried venison. "I am a prisoner," Clara thought, tears freezing on her eyelashes, traded from a debtor to a monster. By the evening of the second day, the dense pine forest finally broke, revealing a plateau overlooking the world. There, nestled against the jagged granite face of the mountain, sat a sprawling, heavily fortified log cabin. Smoke billowed from a massive stone chimney. As the horse approached, the heavy oak door creaked open. Clara slid from the horse, her legs numb, and stared at the porch. Standing there, lined up like a hostile militia, were her new stepchildren. They were covered in soot and dirt, wearing clothes that were little more than patched rags. The oldest, Thomas, 14, stood at the front, his jaw set in a hard line, holding a Winchester rifle with terrifying familiarity. Next to him was Sarah, 12, whose dark eyes glared at Clara with naked hatred. Levi, 9, stood slightly behind Sarah, silent and watchful, while little Caleb, 6, was practically hanging from the porch railing, clutching a hunting knife. Tucked behind all of them, coughing weakly into a dirty blanket, was the youngest, 3-year-old Mary. "Put the rifle down, boy," Jedediah ordered as he swung down from the saddle. Thomas didn't lower the weapon. "You brought a town girl, Pa? She looks like she'd snap in half if the wind blew." "I brought a wife," Jedediah corrected, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "And you will treat her with respect, or you'll be sleeping in the barn with the mules." He grabbed Clara's small satchel and pushed open the door. Clara followed him inside, stepping into a world of overwhelming chaos. The cabin, though large and structurally sound, was a disaster. Animal traps were strewn across the floor. The heavy oak dining table was covered in unwashed tin plates and half-skin pelts, and the smell of wet dog and old grease hung heavy in the air. It was the home of a man who had abandoned all pretense of civilization. Jedediah pointed a massive, calloused finger to a small cot tucked into the corner near the hearth. "That's your bed," he said bluntly. "Mine is in the back room. I don't expect nothing from you in the dark, Clara. I bought a mother for my kids and a keeper for my house. You wake at dawn, you cook, you clean, and you keep them alive while I hunt." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked back out to tend to the horse, leaving Clara alone with the 5 hostile children. Sarah stepped forward, crossing her arms. "Our real ma died of the mountain fever," she sneered. "She was strong. You ain't. We don't want you here. And we don't need you." Clara looked at the dirty, angry faces staring back at her. The despair that had been clawing at her throat threatened to swallow her whole. She wanted to collapse onto the dirty floor and weep until she died. But then, she looked at little Mary, who let out a wet, rattling cough, her tiny face flushed with an unhealthy heat. Something inside Clara, a hardened kernel of survival she didn't know she possessed, snapped into place. If she cried, she was dead. If she broke, the mountain would take her. Mayor Whitfield had wanted her as a plaything. Her father had sold her as property. Jedediah Boone had bought her as a servant. "No," Clara thought, lifting her chin. "I am not a victim anymore. I am going to survive this." She walked over to the hearth, picked up a heavy cast-iron poker, and slammed it against the stone fireplace. The loud clang made the children jump. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, but carrying a sharp authority that surprised even her. "I don't care if you want me here, Sarah. I am here, and as long as I am, You will not live like wild animals." She pointed at Thomas. "Put that rifle away and bring in some fresh firewood. Sarah, fetch me boiling water. We are scrubbing this cabin from top to bottom, and then we are scrubbing you." The children stared at her, stunned into silence by the sudden show of spine from the fragile town girl. When Jedediah walked back 10 minutes later, he stopped dead in his tracks. His children were actually moving, Thomas hauling logs, Sarah aggressively scrubbing a pot, and Clara, with her sleeves rolled up, organizing the chaos. Jedediah watched her for a long moment from the shadows of the doorway. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his scarred face before he silently slipped into his room. The first 6 weeks were a brutal war of attrition. The Blackwood Peaks did not forgive weakness, and the Boone children were determined to break their new stepmother. They tested her constantly. Caleb put a live king snake in her laundry basket. Clara calmly picked it up behind the head and tossed it out the back door without missing a beat. Thomas accidentally dropped her freshly baked bread into the dirt. Clara made him eat it anyway, dirt and all. Sarah refused to speak to her, and Levi would hide her sewing needles. But Clara worked with a relentless, manic energy. Her hands, once soft and pale, blistered, bled, and turned heavily calloused. She learned to chop wood, to bleed a slaughtered rabbit, to mend thick canvas. She cooked hearty stews, baked bread that didn't taste like ash, and slowly, the filth was scrubbed from the cabin. Jedediah remained a ghost in his own home. He left before sunrise to run his trap lines and returned long after dark. He spoke little, but Clara noticed small things. When she complained of the draft, she woke to find the window frames freshly sealed with pitch. When she struggled with the heavy iron water bucket, a new, lighter wooden one appeared on the porch. He was watching her, and he was waiting for her to fail. The turning point came in the dead of December. A monstrous blizzard hit the peaks, a whiteout that buried the cabin in 4 feet of snow overnight. Jedediah had been caught out on the upper ridge checking traps. He didn't return that night, or the next. Panic began to set in among the older children, but the real terror struck on the 3rd day of the storm. Little Mary woke up screaming. Clara rushed to the child's cot. Mary was burning up, her skin radiating heat like a furnace. The terrible wet cough had returned, but this time, her lips were turning blue. It was a severe lung fever. "She's dying," Sarah whispered, tears finally breaking through her hardened exterior. "That's how Ma started. She's gonna die, and Pa isn't here." "She is not going to die," Clara snapped, her maternal instincts completely overtaking her fear. "Thomas, keep the fire blazing. Do not let it drop. Sarah, get me the whiskey from your father's chest and every clean rag we have. Levi, bring snow to melt." For 48 straight hours, Clara did not sleep. She fought a desperate, bloody battle against death itself. She forced a tincture of boiled pine needles, honey, and a drop of whiskey down Mary's throat. She created a steam tent over the child's bed using a boiling pot of water and heavy blankets to loosen the phlegm in her lungs. When Mary convulsed from the fever, Clara held her down, singing softly to her, wiping her face with cold snow water until the spasms passed. The older children watched in awe. This fragile town girl was fighting for their sister's life with the ferocity of a mother bear. On the morning of the 5th day, the storm finally broke. Sunlight pierced through the frosted windows. Clara was slumped against the wall beside Mary's cot, utterly exhausted, her eyes bruised with fatigue. The heavy front door suddenly burst open. Jedediah staggered in, covered in ice and snow, looking half dead himself. His wild eyes immediately scanned the room, expecting the worst. He saw Thomas, Sarah, Levi, and Caleb sitting quietly around the hearth. And then he saw Clara. Mary was sitting up, breathing easily, drinking a cup of warm broth. Clara was holding to her lips. The fever had broken. Jedediah dropped his heavy pack. He walked over to the cot, falling to his knees beside it. He placed a massive, trembling hand on his daughter's cool forehead. Then, he looked up at Clara. For the first time, the cold steel in his eyes had melted. There was profound gratitude, and something else, a deep, shocking reverence. "You saved her," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I did," Clara replied, her voice hoarse but steady. "Because she is mine now, too. They all are." That night, the dynamic in the cabin fundamentally shifted. Thomas brought Clara a cup of tea without being asked. Sarah quietly sat beside her and helped her mend a shirt. The war with the children was over. She had won, but the true shock was yet to come. 2 days later, while Jedediah was resting and recovering from his ordeal in the snow, Clara decided to deep clean the area under his heavy oak desk in the back room, a place she had previously avoided. As she scrubbed the floorboards, one of the planks shifted beneath her rag. Frowning, Clara pried the loose board up. Beneath it sat a heavy black iron lockbox. Curiosity overrode her sense of privacy. The box wasn't locked. The latch was simply stiff. She popped it open, expecting to find old letters from his late wife, or perhaps more gold dust. Instead, she found stacks of legal documents. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and carefully pulled them out. As she read the heavy, formal print, the blood drained from her face. These weren't just the deeds to the Blackwood Peaks. There were railway surveys, mineral rights contracts, and most shockingly, ledgers. Detailed, meticulously kept ledgers documenting massive, illicit payouts. The names signed at the bottom of the bribes, the land grabs, and the extortion schemes was unmistakable. Mayor Horace Whitfield. Clara stared at the papers, her mind spinning wildly. Jedediah Boone wasn't just a rugged, isolated mountain man. He was holding the financial and legal noose that could hang the most powerful man in Oakhaven. Suddenly, the doorway darkened. Jedediah stood there, his massive frame filling the space, staring down at her with the documents in her hands. "You weren't supposed to find those, Clara," he said softly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she looked up from the wooden floorboards. The heavy iron lockbox sat open between her knees, a silent testament to secrets that could get them all killed. Jedediah Boone, the giant of the Blackwood Peaks, stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the only exit. The dim light from the hearth cast long, dancing shadows across his scarred face, rendering him unreadable. Clara did not drop the papers. Instead, she slowly pushed herself up from the floor, clutching the ledgers to her chest. The girl who had trembled in the Golden Spur saloon was gone, replaced by a woman who had fought off a mountain winter and dragged a child back from the edge of death. "What is this, Jedediah?" Clara asked, her voice eerily calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "These are Mayor Whitfield's private ledgers. You have the deeds to half the Oakhaven Valley here. Railway surveys, extortion records." Jedediah closed the door with a soft, heavy click. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy boots making no sound on the rugs. He stopped just a foot away, looking down at the documents, and then up into Clara's defiant eyes. For a long moment, the silence in the room was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire in the main room. "I wasn't always a mountain man, Clara," Jedediah began, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur that commanded her entire attention. 10 years ago, I was the chief surveyor for the Colorado territorial government. I was the man they sent into the untamed peaks to map the mineral veins, to draw the lines that would bring the railway and civilization to this godforsaken territory. He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers gently brushing the edge of the stiff parchment in her hands. Horace Whitfield was just a local magistrate back then, but he was ambitious, Jedediah continued, a dark, simmering anger bleeding into his tone. He found out I had mapped a massive vein of silver beneath the valley floorland owned by poor, struggling prospectors and immigrant farmers. Whitfield wanted me to alter the surveys. He wanted me to declare the land barren so he could buy it for pennies, evict the families, and then reap the millions when the railway came through. I refused. Clara watched him, captivated by the raw pain etched into his features. The myth of the wild, unfeeling beast was shattering before her eyes, revealing a man burdened by immense, suffocating grief. "He didn't take kindly to a man with a conscience," Jedediah said softly. "I had a wife then, Rebecca. She was fierce, beautiful. We had Thomas, Sarah, and the others were just babes. Whitfield knew he couldn't break me with money, so he tried to break me with fear. He sent men to our homestead in the valley while I was away mapping the high passes." Jedediah turned away, walking to the frosted window, staring out at the blinding white expanse of the mountain. "They poisoned our well, a slow-acting arsenic compound used in the mining camps. By the time I returned, Rebecca was dead. The children had survived because she had boiled their water for tea, but she had drunk straight from the pump. Whitfield's corrupt sheriff ruled it mountain fever, a tragic outbreak. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Sarah told me her mother died of the fever. You never told them? How could I? Jedediah looked back at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. How do you tell a boy like Thomas that his mother was murdered for silver, and that the man who ordered it is sitting in the mayor's office sipping fine brandy? If I told Thomas, he would have taken a rifle down to Oakhaven and gotten himself hanged. So, I took them. I took them high into the Blackwood Peaks, where Whitfield's men were too cowardly to follow. I let the town believe I went mad with grief. I let them build the myth of the monster. But the lockbox, Clara prompted, looking down at the papers. I didn't just hide, Jedediah said, his jaw tightening. For 5 years I've been quietly riding down under the cover of darkness. I've been raiding Whitfield's courier routes. I intercepted his mail, robbed his bagmen, and stole his private ledgers right out of his secure vaults. I've been building a federal case. I have enough evidence in that box to hang Horace Whitfield and every corrupt judge in the territory. Clara finally understood. The puzzle pieces slammed together with blinding clarity. The saloon, she whispered. That night my father tried to sell me. You weren't there to trade furs. I was tracking one of Whitfield's bagmen, Jedediah confirmed. But then I saw you. I saw Whitfield looking at you the way a wolf looks at a tethered lamb. I saw a young woman about to be swallowed by the same evil that took my wife. I couldn't save Rebecca, Clara, but I could save you. The gold I threw on the table was Whitfield's own stolen bribe money. A profound silence settled between them. The revelation shifted the very foundation of their marriage. Jedediah hadn't bought a servant. He had staged a rescue. He had risked blowing his cover, risked his years of meticulous planning to pull a stranger out of the fire. Clara looked at this towering, scarred man, and for the first time, she didn't see a captor. She saw a protector, a man of unshakable, devastating honor. Without thinking, Clara closed the distance between them. She reached up, her small, calloused hands gently resting against the thick wool of his coat, directly over his heart. Jedediah went perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. You are not a monster, Jedediah Boone, Clara said fiercely, her voice thick with emotion. You are the best man I have ever known. Slowly, hesitantly, as if terrified he might break her, Jedediah brought his massive hands up and rested them on her waist. He looked down into her eyes, searching for fear and finding only absolute, unyielding loyalty. When he finally leaned down and kissed her, it wasn't the forceful demand of a master, but the desperate, starving plea of a man who had been alone in the dark for far too long. Clara kissed him back, pouring all her newfound strength, her gratitude, and her blossoming love into the embrace. As winter slowly bled into spring, the atmosphere in the cabin transformed. The bitter cold gave way to the vibrant, chaotic bloom of mountain columbines and wild sage. The ice on the Blackwood River shattered, roaring down the mountain with a furious, life-giving energy. Inside the cabin, the change was just as profound. Clara and Jedediah were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were partners. He taught her how to shoot the heavy Winchester rifle, his arms wrapped around her from behind, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. In return, Clara taught the younger children how to read using the few books Jedediah had salvaged, turning the hearth into a makeshift classroom. Thomas began calling her Ma without realizing it. Sarah no longer glared, but instead shadowed Clara's every move, eager to learn how to bake and sew. The family was whole. It was forged in ice and sealed in fire. But down in the valley of Oakhaven, the ice was also melting, and Mayor Horace Whitfield had finally realized that his ledgers were missing. He had connected the dots, the missing couriers, the vanished bribe money, the sudden brazen appearance of the mountain man in his saloon. Whitfield knew the monster of Blackwood Peaks had his secrets, and Whitfield was not a man who left loose ends alive. The attack came in late May, on a Tuesday when the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Jedediah had left before dawn. The spring thaw meant the high mountain passes were finally clear, and he needed to check the perimeter traps along the eastern ridge, a grueling 10-mile trek. He had kissed Clara softly on the forehead, strapped his heavy revolver to his hip, and promised to be back before nightfall. By noon, Clara was outside on the porch, her sleeves rolled up, aggressively churning a barrel of fresh butter. Caleb and Mary were playing in the dirt near the woodpile, while Levi was meticulously whittling a stick on the bottom step. Thomas and Sarah were around the back, tending to the small, newly planted vegetable garden. It was an idyllic, peaceful afternoon, until the dogs started barking. Jedediah kept 3 massive wolfhound mixes, brutal, fiercely loyal animals that usually slept lazily under the porch. Suddenly, all 3 dogs erupted into a frenzy of vicious snarling, the hair on their backs standing straight up as they bolted toward the tree line. Clara stopped churning. A cold dread pooled in her stomach. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the edge of the porch, straining her eyes against the dappled sunlight of the pine forest. The birds had gone completely silent. "Levi," Clara said, her voice low and sharp. "Get Caleb and Mary. Go inside. Now." Levi didn't question her tone. He dropped his knife, grabbed his younger siblings by the hands, and hustled them through the heavy oak door. Clara stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward the corner of the cabin. "Thomas, Sarah," she hissed. Thomas appeared around the corner, a spade in his hand, wiping sweat from his brow. "What is it, Ma?" "Someone is coming up the trail. The dogs have caught a scent." Clara's mind raced, pulling from everything Jedediah had taught her. Get inside. Bar the back door. Pull the heavy shutters closed on all the ground floor windows. "But Pa ain't home," Sarah panicked, dropping her watering can. "I know," Clara said, her eyes narrowing as she finally saw them. Through the dense trees, half a mile down the muddy trail, she spotted the riders. 5 men. They weren't moving casually. They were riding hard, pushing their horses up the steep incline with brutal urgency. Even from a distance, Clara recognized the man leading the pack. It was Clayton Briggs, Mayor Whitfield's chief enforcer, a ruthless, dead-eyed killer known for breaking strikes and disappearing witnesses. They weren't here to trade. They were heavily armed, carrying repeating rifles and saddlebags stuffed with ammunition. Whitfield had sent his hounds to wipe the mountain clean. "Inside." Clara shoved Thomas and Sarah toward the door. She grabbed the heavy wooden butter churn and dragged it inside before slamming the massive oak door shut. She threw the heavy iron bolt, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden quiet of the cabin. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. She was a 19-year-old girl, and 5 hardened killers were minutes away from her doorstep. She closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and pictured Jedediah's steady, steel-colored eyes. "You are a frontier woman now," she told herself. "Act like it." "Thomas," Clara commanded, her voice terrifyingly calm. "Get the Winchester from the mantel. Sarah, take the children down into the root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear up here. Do you understand me?" Sarah, weeping silently, nodded and began herding the terrified younger children toward the trapdoor in the kitchen. Clara marched to the weapons chest at the foot of her bed. She pulled out a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun, a monstrous weapon meant for dropping charging grizzly bears. She broke the barrel, slid 2 heavy brass-capped shells into the chambers, and snapped it shut with a satisfying clack. Outside, the heavy thud of hooves grew louder, followed by the sickening sound of a single gunshot. One of the dogs yelped, and then the snarling stopped. Clara's blood ran cold. They had killed the dogs. "Hello, the house," a sneering voice echoed from the clearing outside. It was Briggs. "We know you're in there, little lady. Open up. We're here on official town business." Clara moved to the front window, peering through a small crack in the heavy wooden shutters. Briggs and his 4 men had dismounted. They were fanned out in a semicircle, using the woodpile and the water trough for cover, their rifles trained on the cabin walls. "Jedediah Boone is not here," Clara shouted through the heavy wood, keeping her body pressed flat against the wall. "State your business and get off our land." Briggs laughed, a dry, grating sound. "We know Boone is gone, sweetheart. We watched him ride the upper ridge hours ago. Mayor Whitfield sends his regards. He wants his property back. Hand over the lockbox, and we'll make this quick and painless. Refuse, and we burn this cabin to the ground with you and those feral brats inside." They had underestimated her. They thought they were dealing with the fragile, broken girl from the Golden Spur Saloon. Clara looked at Thomas, who was pale and shaking, but holding the Winchester steady, aimed at the door. If they breach the door, Thomas, you shoot the first man through. You do not hesitate. Yes, Ma, Thomas whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Briggs, Clara screamed, her voice cutting through the mountain air like a blade. I am giving you one warning. Mount your horses and ride away, or you will die on this mountain. Burn it, Briggs roared to his men. One of the men broke cover, sprinting toward the porch with a lit torch made of pitch-soaked rags. Clara didn't hesitate. She shoved the barrel of the 10-gauge shotgun through the narrow firing slit in the shutter and pulled the front trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The recoil slammed into Clara's shoulder like the kick of a mule, knocking her backward onto the floorboards. Outside, a cloud of black powder smoke erupted. The man with the torch was thrown completely backward off the porch, his chest obliterated by the heavy buckshot, the torch falling harmlessly into the damp mud. Fire! Briggs screamed in shock. The cabin erupted in a hail of lead. Bullets tore through the heavy oak walls, splintering wood and shattering the clay pots in the kitchen. Clara scrambled across the floor, her ears ringing from the shotgun blast, grabbing a handful of extra shells from her apron pocket. Keep down, Thomas, she yelled over the deafening roar of the gunfire. For 10 agonizing minutes, they were pinned under a relentless barrage. Clara reloaded and fired blindly through the slits, her shoulder throbbing with agonizing pain. She managed to clip another man in the leg, but there were still 3 left, and they were moving closer, aiming to shoot off the door hinges. The wood of the front door began to splinter and crack under the concentrated rifle fire. They're coming through, Thomas yelled in panic. Clara leveled the shotgun at the doorway, her hands shaking violently. She was out of options. She prepared to die defending the root cellar. Suddenly, the gunfire outside stopped. It wasn't a gradual ceasefire. It was an abrupt, terrifying silence, followed by a wet, sickening crunch and a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the pines. Clara and Thomas froze, staring at the shattered door. Outside, a deep, primal roar shook the very earth, the sound of absolute, unrestrained fury. Jedediah Boone had returned, and he had caught the mayor's hounds from behind. Through the cracks in the shutters, Clara witnessed a slaughter. Jedediah hadn't bothered to draw his revolver. He had descended upon them like an avalanche. He swung his massive, steel-headed, wood-splitting maul, crushing a man's chest cavity with a single, devastating blow. Briggs turned, his face pale with sheer terror, and raised his rifle. Jedediah didn't flinch. He threw his heavy hunting knife with terrifying speed. The blade buried itself to the hilt in Briggs's shoulder, pinning him against the woodpile. The last remaining man didn't even try to fight. He dropped his rifle and sprinted for the tree line, only to be tackled by Jedediah, who broke the man's jaw with a single, brutal punch. Within 60 seconds, the siege was over. The clearing was silent, save for the groans of the wounded men. Clara threw open the heavy bolt and stepped out onto the blood-slicked porch, the shotgun still gripped tightly in her hands. Jedediah stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his hands covered in blood. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with adrenaline, scanning her for injuries. When he saw she was unharmed, the giant of the mountain dropped to his knees in the mud, bowing his head in overwhelming relief. Clara walked down the steps, bypassing the groaning Briggs, and knelt in the mud in front of her husband. She dropped the shotgun and threw her arms around his massive neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Jedediah crushed her to him, his trembling hands stroking her hair. I heard the shots, he rasped, his voice breaking. I thought I was too late. I thought I lost you. We held them off, Clara whispered fiercely into his ear. We protected our home. After binding the surviving men and locking them in the sturdy stone smokehouse, Jedediah and Clara sat at the splintered dining table. The children were safe, unharmed, and finally asleep in the back room. The lockbox sat open on the table between them. Whitfield crossed the line. Jedediah said coldly, washing his bloody knuckles in a tin basin. He won't stop. He'll send a dozen men next time. An army, if he has to. We can't stay here, Clara agreed. her eyes burning with a dangerous new fire. Not while he holds power. If we stay on the defensive, we will eventually lose. Jedediah looked at her, surprised by the cold calculation in her voice. What are you saying, Clara? Clara placed her hand firmly on the stack of incriminating ledgers. I'm saying we stop hiding, Jedediah. We take the war to him. Next week is the Oak Haven Founders Day Gala. The entire town will be there, including the territorial governor, the press from Denver, and every judge in the district. It's the one time Mayor Whitfield cannot silence a disruption. A slow, predatory smile spread across Jedediah's scarred face. He realized exactly what his brilliant, fearless wife was proposing. We are going back down the mountain, Clara stated, her voice hardening into steel. And we are going to burn Horace Whitfield's empire to the ground. The Oak Haven Founders Day Gala was the crown jewel of Mayor Horace Whitfield's social calendar, held in the newly constructed Grand Assembly Hall. The event was a glittering display of the wealth he had squeezed from the valley. Crystal chandeliers, imported at great expense from Chicago, cast a golden glow over the town's elite. Women in silk taffeta gowns fanned themselves, while men in stiff-collared suits smoked imported cigars and discussed railway stocks. At the center of it all stood Mayor Whitfield, holding a glass of French champagne. He was holding court with the most important guest of the evening, Frederick Walker Pitkin, the actual territorial governor of Colorado. Governor Pitkin, a stern, heavily bearded man known for his rigid adherence to the law, had traveled by specialized rail car just to attend. Whitfield was using the evening to secure his appointment to a federal judgeship, pouring honeyed lies into the governor's ear about the peace and prosperity of Oak Haven. Whitfield was in excellent spirits. He assumed Clayton Briggs and his men had successfully burned the Boone cabin to ashes. The mountain man was dead, the ledgers were destroyed, and the girl, well, she was a casualty of progress. At precisely 8 o'clock, the string quartet was midway through a waltz when the heavy mahogany double doors of the assembly hall groaned open. A gust of cool evening air swept through the stifling room, fluttering the flames of the chandeliers. The music faltered, a cellist missing a note, before bleeding to a complete and agonizing halt. Standing in the threshold was Clara Boone. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Gwendolyn Pritchard, the town gossip who had predicted Clara's death months ago, dropped her crystal goblet. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, the sound mimicking a gunshot in the dead silence. They had expected a corpse. If not a corpse, then a broken, starved creature driven mad by the feral children of the Blackwood Peaks. Instead, Clara looked like an avenging angel. She was wearing a stunning, dark emerald riding habit, a garment she had meticulously tailored from the finest fabrics found in Jedediah's trunks. Her porcelain skin, once pale with fear, was flushed with the vibrant, healthy glow of mountain living. She stood perfectly straight, her chin held high, radiating a dangerous, untouchable confidence. And looming directly behind her, dressed in a dark, immaculately clean broadcloth suit that barely contained his massive shoulders, was Jedediah Boone. The silver scar on his face caught the chandelier light, turning his stoic expression into something out of a Greek tragedy. He did not look like a wild beast of the hills. He looked like a king arriving to reclaim his stolen throne. "Good evening, Oak Haven," Clara said. Her voice, refined yet forged in the fires of the high peaks, carried effortlessly to the back of the hall. Mayor Whitfield's face drained of all color. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers, spilling over his polished boots. "You," he choked out, his eyes darting frantically toward the doors, expecting his enforcer, Briggs, to step out from the shadows. "Looking for Mr. Briggs, Horace?" Jedediah's gravelly voice rumbled through the hall, causing several of the townswomen to instinctively step back. "He couldn't make it. He's currently chained to my smokehouse wall, nursing a broken shoulder and waiting for the federal marshals." Governor Pitkin stepped forward, his bushy eyebrows knitting together in confusion and rising anger. "Mayor Whitfield, what is the meaning of this? Who are these people? And why are they speaking of federal marshals?" Clara walked forward, the sea of terrified aristocrats parting for her like the Red Sea. She didn't spare her father, Josiah Higgins, a single glance as she passed him cowering near the punch bowl. She walked directly up to Governor Pitkin. In her hands, she held the heavy, black iron lockbox. "Governor Pitkin," Clara said, executing a flawless, respectful curtsy before meeting the man's eyes with unwavering steel. "My name is Clara Boone. This is my husband, Jedediah Boone, formerly the chief surveyor of the Colorado Territory. We have traveled down from the Blackwood Peaks to present you with a gift." She unlatched the lockbox and pushed the heavy lid open. "Inside," Clara continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority, "you will find the private financial ledgers of Mayor Horace Whitfield. They detail 5 years of extortion, bribery of local magistrates, the hiring of thugs to violently evict lawful prospectors, and the fraudulent altering of territorial mineral surveys to steal silver-rich land." The hall erupted into a cacophony of panicked whispers. Whitfield lunged forward, his face twisting into an ugly mask of desperation. "Lies. Governor, this man is a deranged hermit. He's a murderer who lives with wolves. He forced that poor girl to come here and spout this lunacy. Deputies, arrest them." 3 of Whitfield's town deputies drew their revolvers, but before they could even level the barrels, the deafening clack-clack of a lever-action rifle froze them in their tracks. 14-year-old Thomas Boone had stepped out from the shadows of the coat room, flanked by Sarah. Thomas had the Winchester rifle leveled directly at the chest of the nearest deputy. His hands were completely steady. "Drop the iron," Thomas ordered, his voice echoing his father's terrifying calm. "Or I'll drop you." Governor Pitkin, ignoring the drawn weapons, reached into the lockbox. He pulled out the first ledger, adjusting his spectacles. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the meticulous records, the dates, the names, and the staggering sums of money. With every page he turned, the governor's face grew darker, the vein in his forehead throbbing with righteous fury. "These are your signatures, Horace," Pitkin whispered, looking up. "These are dates corresponding perfectly with the tragic evictions of the Valley farmers. You've been robbing the territorial government blind." "Governor, I can explain," Whitfield stammered, sweating profusely. "And worse." Jedediah stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the mayor. The sheer physical presence of the mountain man seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "The records also prove that you purchased the arsenic used to poison the well at my homestead 10 years ago. You murdered my wife, Horace. You tried to murder my children." The town of Oakhaven gasped as one. The myth of the beast of Blackwood Peaks was dead. In its place stood a tragic hero, a man who had endured unspeakable agony and protected his children in exile while the true monster sat in the mayor's chair. Realizing his empire had just evaporated, Whitfield snapped. With a feral cry, he reached inside his tailored coat and pulled a hidden silver Derringer pistol, aiming it directly at Clara's heart. He never got the chance to pull the trigger. Jedediah moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He struck like a striking diamondback, grabbing Whitfield's wrist and twisting it savagely upward. The bone snapped with a sickening crack, sending the Derringer clattering across the floorboards. Whitfield dropped to his knees, screaming in agony. Jedediah stood over the broken mayor, his fists clenched, his chest heaving. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the mountain man to crush Whitfield's skull and take his bloody vengeance. But Clara stepped forward and placed her small, calloused hand over Jedediah's massive fist. "No, Jedediah," she said softly, her eyes filled with love and an unyielding strength. "He wants you to be the monster he painted you as. Don't give him the satisfaction. Let the rope do the work." Jedediah looked down at his wife. The murderous rage slowly bled from his eyes, replaced by a profound peace. He uncurled his fist and stepped back, leaving Whitfield sobbing on the floor. Governor Pitkin turned to the stunned deputies, who had long since dropped their weapons under Thomas's watchful eye. "Arrest this man," the governor barked. "Lock him in the federal transport car. I will see him hanged in Denver myself." The aftermath of the Founders' Day Gala swept through Oakhaven like a cleansing wildfire. By morning, Mayor Whitfield was on a heavily guarded train to Denver, facing charges of grand larceny, treason against the territory, and murder. Clayton Briggs and the surviving enforcers were dragged from the Boone smokehouse and thrown into federal custody. The corrupt judges and bankers who had profited off Whitfield's ledgers fled the territory like rats from a sinking ship, leaving Oakhaven to rebuild itself under the watchful, honest eye of Governor Pitkin's appointed marshals. Josiah Higgins, humiliated and terrified of his daughter's newfound power, quietly packed his meager belongings and left town in the dead of night, never to be seen in the Colorado territory again. Clara did not look for him. She had a real family now. Before leaving Oak Haven, Governor Pitkin formally reinstated the stolen deeds to the rightful families who had been evicted by Whitfield. But the largest tract of land, the massive silver-rich valley floor that had once been Jedediah's homestead, was returned to the Boone family, along with a staggering sum of recovered gold that Whitfield had hoarded in the town bank. Overnight, Jedediah and Clara Boone became the wealthiest, most powerful landowners in the county. The townspeople, particularly Gwendolyn Pritchard and the high society ladies, suddenly fell over themselves trying to apologize, to invite Clara to tea, to curry favor with the new queen of the valley. But Clara politely and coldly declined them all. She had seen what their civilization looked like, and she wanted no part of it. Instead, Clara and Jedediah went to the general store. They bought 3 wagons worth of supplies: fine milled flour, sugar, new bolts of cotton and wool, sturdy leather boots for all 5 children, dozens of books, a grand piano, and a massive, ornate iron cast stove. They loaded the wagons, whistled for their remaining dogs, and began the long trek back up into the Blackwood Peaks. "We don't have to go back up there, you know," Jedediah said quietly as he drove the lead wagon, looking at Clara sitting beside him. "We have enough money to build a mansion in the valley. We could send the children to the finest schools in the east." Clara looked out over the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the mountain that had tested her, broken her down, and rebuilt her into a woman of iron. She thought of the cozy hearth, the smell of pine needles, and the profound, beautiful silence of the high country. "The valley is where the snakes live," Jedediah, Clara smiled, resting her head against his massive shoulder. "Our home is on the mountain. Besides, who else is going to teach Mary how to shoot?" Jedediah threw his head back and laughed, a rich, booming sound that echoed through the pines and chased away the last lingering ghosts of his past. Over the next decade, the Boone cabin was transformed. It was no longer a fortified shack of a grieving exile, but a sprawling, beautiful mountain estate. The feral children grew into remarkable adults. Thomas became a highly respected sheriff in the reformed Oak Haven, carrying his father's legacy of uncompromising justice. Sarah, who had shadowed Clara's every move, moved to Denver and opened a clinic, becoming one of the first female physicians in the territory. Levi took over the surveying business. Caleb became a renowned horse breeder, and little Mary grew up wild, brilliant, and fiercely protective of her beloved mother. Jedediah never fully lost his intimidating aura, but the silver-scarred mountain man was known to ride down into Oak Haven not to terrorize it, but to buy imported chocolates for his wife. They were partners in every sense of the word, an unstoppable force forged in the crucible of the Wild West. The legend of Clara Boone became a cornerstone of Colorado folklore, whispered over campfires and printed in dime novels back east. They called her the Iron Bride of Blackwood. She was the 19-year-old girl traded like a poker chip to a terrifying giant, condemned by a corrupt town to die in the freezing wilderness. Yet, she did not merely survive the mountain. She conquered it. She tamed a broken man's shattered heart, raised 5 wild children into titans of the frontier, and single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of the most ruthless political empire in the territory. The townsfolk of Oak Haven had believed they were sending a fragile lamb into the den of a monster. They never realized that by throwing Clara into the fire, they had forged a queen who would eventually return to burn their wicked kingdom to the ground.